Under the bold and visionary leadership of the Honorable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji, India has already taken tremendous actions and initiatives to tackle the global collective action problem of climate change, including inter alia, setting up of International Solar Alliance, Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, raising the domestic renewable energy target to 450 gigawatt by 2030, and continuing efforts to decouple its emissions from economic growth. As a United Nations Champions of the Earth awardee for policy leadership, the Honorable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji is a statesman who not only recognizes, knows and understands the enormous benefits of climate action, but also he acts with enormous energy to make this change. And this leadership today is more necessary than ever, not only for India, but for the whole world.
आज भारत को ये संकल्प लेना होगा कि हम आजादी के 100 साल होने से पहले भारत को एनर्जी इंडिपेंडेंट बनाएंगे। भारत आज जो भी कार्य कर रहा है उसमें सबसे बड़ा लक्ष्य है जो भारत को क्लाइमेट के क्षेत्र में क्वांटम जंप देने वाला है, वो है ग्रीन हाइड्रोजन का क्षेत्र। ग्रीन हाइड्रोजन के क्षेत्र के लक्ष्य की प्राप्ति के लिए मैं आज इस तिरंगे की साक्षी में नेशनल हाइड्रोजन मिशन की घोषणा कर रहा हूं। अमृत काल में हमें भारत को ग्रीन हाइड्रोजन के प्रोडक्शन और एक्सपोर्ट का ग्लोबल हब बनाना है। ये ऊर्जा के क्षेत्र में भारत की एक नई प्रगति उसको आत्मनिर्भर बढ़ाएगा और पूरे विश्व में क्लीन एनर्जी ट्रांजिशन की नई प्रेरणा भी बनेगा।
This will not only help India to make a new progress in the field of energy self-reliance, but will also become a new inspiration for clean energy transition all over the world. The International Climate Summit 2021, powering India's hydrogen ecosystem, is a progressive step to achieve the objective set by the Honorable Prime Minister to make India a global hub for green hydrogen production and export. Conceived by Dr. J.P. Gupta, Chairman EAC Industry, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Government of India, ICS 2021 is an initiative of the Environment Committee of PhD Chamber of Commerce and Industry. As a precursor to the COP26 scheduled during November 2021 at Glasgow, the International Summit is bringing together policymakers, regulators, Nobel laureates, industry titans, experts, scientists, and over 25,000 stakeholders from across the world to discussions on all related topics, propelling India as a key player in the global hydrogen economy. The summit agenda includes release of a special knowledge book titled Self-Reliant India, Harnessing the Power of Hydrogen by the Indo-Norwegian Alliance, the launch of the National Hydrogen Portal, recommendations on the formation of an International Hydrogen Alliance similar to the International Solar Alliance, and the setting up of Centers of Excellence in select universities across India that will assist in capacity building through a strong knowledge base and R&D. Fostering global collaboration in establishing sustainable routes for production, storage, transportation, distribution of hydrogen. The summit would also provide a host of commercial opportunities, including securing joint venture, technology, supply chain, or international funding partners for production, storage, transportation and distribution of hydrogen. A catalytic moment presenting these next-generation clean energy opportunities. The summit is dedicated to achieving the Honorable Prime Minister's recently announced target of achieving 100% self-reliance in energy by 2047.
A very good evening and welcome to all the participants in this extremely interesting session. I hope it's going to be an interesting session on the role of hydrogen in carbon neutral Ladakh. Development of Ladakh it's an extremely important region of the country, and it's going to be very, very critical in the future development scenario in India. Uh, and Ladakh is a very special region because not only because it's a state on the border of the country in the northern borders, but also it's a hilly region, which is a cold region, and it has typical uh, geographical peculiarities and regional specificities, more so in the context of climate change, which is affecting the entire globe, entire nation, and those regions which are vulnerable to climate change, they have some particular responses in terms of development, which is unfolding. And to discuss this, we are planning to discuss the role of hydrogen in the future development of Ladakh in order to make it carbon neutral. As you know, carbon neutrality and decarbonization is an emerging, it's a part of emerging global climate change discourse. The several countries have announced net zero goal by 2050. Ladakh is one special region in the country which Prime Minister himself has given special attention, and he has announced that he hopes to see that Ladakh develops as a carbon neutral region in the recent years to come. There's no fixed dateline, but it is the the single important state in the country is the union territory at the moment, but this is the only region in the country where Prime Minister himself has announced that he hopes to make it carbon neutral. So this is a very important policy signal from the government of India. Now, how do we do this? This is a difficult task anywhere, and more so in a hilly region and a region like Ladakh, where the energy requirements are going to grow. The It's entirely dependent on energy, on fossil fuels, on energy that is the fossil fuels that are brought from outside the region. Of course, in the recent past, there have been attempts at enhancing the solar potential of the solar energy in the region, and several initiatives have been taken. There are other stakeholders which have also started to play a role in bringing the issue of hydrogen in the developmental matrix of Ladakh. And that's why we have this session today, and we have an extremely interesting panel of 4 or 5 speakers who are going to present their initiatives, their possible contributions, and the role in the way in which they can help making Ladakh a carbon neutral region. And this is going to be true not only of Ladakh. Hydrogen is an initiative that carries a lot of importance for the rest of the country as well. As you might be knowing, that the government of India has announced a national hydrogen mission, which the Prime Minister himself announced with a lot of emphasis, and slowly it's going to gradually unfold the nuts and bolts of this mission, of how we are going to produce hydrogen. There are various variants of hydrogen. There is brown hydrogen, there is the green hydrogen. So are we going to move straight away into green hydrogen, or we are going to follow a gradual policy of transition at different stages, different technologies we are going to employ? How are we going to bring down the cost of hydrogen? What technologies we'll employ? All this will form part of the discussions, of course, globally, nationally, and more so in the typical context of Ladakh. How are we going to deploy hydrogen for the general purpose of development and for the purpose of green energy transition? I have, as I said, very interesting panel. I have Mr. Rajat Sood from the Energy Efficiency Services Limited, an arm of the Government of India. And then Mr. Rajat Sood brings an extremely rich experience of having worked in the energy sector. He has almost 25 years experience in the energy sector, where he has worked on several energy sector restructuring initiative and the energy efficiency in particular. Before joining the EESL, he was with EVP at Sterlite Power Limited, Siemens, PwC. He is, of course, he is an alumni of the IIM Ahmedabad, and he brings the engineering background, of course. So he has a rich academic experience, a very rich industry experience. And today he is leading a very important initiative with EESL on several the energy transition issues. Energy efficiency, of course, happens to be the core competence of EESL, but there are areas in which they are going to, they have launched several innovative schemes which have made it possible for the country to make to leapfrog into areas of emission reduction. And today we will be hearing from him as to how EESL looks at Ladakh as one of the possible regions where they can do this. The next speaker I have is Mr. Savik Bhattacharya. He is Associate Director at TERI, and he has been, he is currently the focal point in TERI for the energy and policy related issues, where a lot of research is being carried out, and he has been the focal point for evolving a strategy on carbon neutral Ladakh in cooperation with NITI Aayog. He has worked on this, so he has studied in detail as to how the energy scenario, energy consumption, the energy profile of Ladakh is going to grow in the next 30 to 40 years, and what is the kind of energy transition initiatives that we need to take. So with the help of Savik, we will try to understand as to how this might happen. The next, I have Mr. Devashish Manas Ranjan Panda, who is currently the GM in the NTPC. And NTPC, as you know, one of the behemoths, energy behemoths in the country, but increasingly it has started investing in the area of renewables and including hydrogen. So we will be hearing from Mr. Panda the role that NTPC is currently playing in sustaining the energy system in India, how he sees this area evolving into hydrogen, and what kind of initiatives they have in mind for Ladakh region. We will be hearing one of the outstanding representatives from the private sector and the corporate sector, who will be speaking to us as to what kind of investments are possible in this area. Dr. Parag Vyas, he is the managing director of Panitech Power Systems, and he has operations in UK, Switzerland, and elsewhere, and also in India. So Mr. Parag, as you know, he has 25 years of experience in the energy and transport sector, and his former roles include being the head of technology in Agreco Corporation and Advanced Concept Center at Rolls-Royce. He has been associated with several government and non-government bodies. He comes with a background in engineering from Imperial College London, and the doctorate from the University of Oxford. So he brings again a rich combination of academic achievements as well as experience of having worked in the corporate sector. So from him, we will be looking at the corporate and the investment perspective of how hydrogen can play a role in the energy transition in India, and more specifically in the region of Ladakh. With this, let me stop here, and then so that I can invite the panelists and the speakers to address the participants. The rules of the game which we will follow here is that we have about an hour and a half with us. in which I'll request the speakers, I'll invite them to introduce themselves briefly and then cover the issues which they would like to address. And then they will have about 12 to 15 minutes each with them. Of course, they are free to slightly modulate it so that we are within the time budget that is allotted to us. And I'll request them to allow me the freedom to ask them the questions at the end of either their presentation immediately or at the end of the session, depending on the questions which we might receive in the chat box or from the participants. So I'll stop here. And let me first invite Mr. Rajat Sood to give his presentation and tell us what EESL plans to do in the area of hydrogen generally and in Ladakh region. Mr. Sood, over to you.
Thanks a lot. It's a privilege and my pleasure to be part of the International Climate Summit 2021. And thank you to Terry, to the PHDCCI who are organizing this summit. It's truly momentous for us to be talking of something which today cannot be imagined. I would say that this is surely the right time for something new to be talked about. And Ladakh, if anywhere in India, is truly the place where we should be dreaming about something which is going to change, revolutionize our way of looking at energy. So, with your permission, I would like to share a few slides around what I see as, I would say, questions on how Ladakh could be made carbon neutral. And I would then leave you with questions around what role could hydrogen be playing in this. Obviously, there are some very easy answers around that. But let's first explore the route to carbon neutrality. And I'm sure that after me, Shovik will come in and do a much more detailed presentation. So not stealing his thunder, but let's look at the current energy mix of Ladakh. This is how the fossil consumption happens in Ladakh. And yeah, so what we see here is that HSD and kerosene, these are the big contributors of consumption today. And we know that these go into automotive use, mobility, as well as in heating, lighting, and cooking. And that's what the majority of consumption is. And this is our endeavor to remove from the Ladakh system and replace it with something. When you look at the electricity side, there's a very healthy mix of generation. 72% comes from hydrogen, which is renewable today, but a good 19% of the capacity comes from diesel. And there are days in winter yeah, just bear with me. Yeah, so what you can see here is that kerosene and HSD are the predominant fuels, and LPG is also a little contributor. The very small grey line that you see is all gasoline or motor spirit or petrol as we know it. So these are the fuels that have to go out, and diesel from the red portion here from the electricity generation mix. Yeah. So if you look at the current greenhouse inventory, 68% is due to energy, and energy from diesel is a good 12%. Transportation is 28%, manufacturing, and you have other sectors that are consuming. So if we are able to address energy and transportation, then we could have addressed quite a large portion of the greenhouse gases. Net, we need to remove 1.83 million tons of carbon, but in all reality, I think we should target to remove 2.57. So what could be the strategies? And I could spend a lot in explaining some of these to you, but I think if you could move our supply side and remove diesel and any other coal power generation that comes from across the border, and have a system which is based on wind and solar, and during the times that the water doesn't freeze, if you can do hydro, plus traded renewables which could come from outside, that could be our supply side. If you could focus on that, on the end use demand side, we know heating, which is currently on, a lot of heating is on kerosene or firewood. Firewood is not per se carbon emitting because it is coming from green sources, but it is very polluting when it is used inside the homes. So both biomass used in cooking as well as in heating is something which has a virtue of replacement. And if you could find a solution for that, that would be very critical for our energy transition in Ladakh. And if you could do this energy transition in Ladakh to move all of our heating, lighting, cooking needs to another format of fuel, a renewable format of fuel, we could make that example easily replicable all over the country. And ESL has thought long and hard about it and has come up with a very innovative scheme of using induction cook stoves. Just to give you an example of what is the possibility of induction cook stoves, they save close to 2,000 rupees today for somebody who's using LPG as the cooking medium. And that's quite significant when you are a BPL consumer. You spend 7 cylinders. With the subsidy, you get these cylinders at roughly 4,200 rupees for your entire year. Whereas if you move to electric induction cooking, you could not only cook faster each time that you cook, you could also save half of that money and reduce your bill, energy bill. And that's the advantage of bringing electricity there. The second big I would say saving comes from the subsidy saving that one achieves over a 5-year lifetime can easily pay for an induction cook stove. Also, if we were to think that this is induction cook stove, how do we ensure that it doesn't consume other formats of electricity and consume solar? We've designed now a system where we could put a battery, a 2-hour cooking battery to it, and feed this power, synchronize the storage of the energy into the cook stove with solar power generation. Solar power generation, by and large, predictable, happens around noon, 3 or 4 hours plus minus noon. And if you could program the cook stove to do this power absorption during this time into the batteries and release this power in the night time, one can transition this to solar cooking without adding any solar panels to the system. And all of this can be done with existing technologies and with rates that are very viable. So when I was talking about the subsidy trade-off, 5 years of subsidy trade-off could give you the investment cost needed in a battery-based cook stove. And it's revenue neutral, therefore, if the government decides to give it to families. And this is something that we are proposing, and should enable, if the proposal goes through, all the households in Ladakh. Other formats that are helpful to transition on the demand side are lighting, move it from kerosene to LED lighting. And even if it is incandescent, it helps to move it to LED lighting because a 100-watt gets replaced with a 10-watt bulb. On the space heating side, we are missing Mr. Wangchuk, but he's done exemplary work on passive cooling, passive heating, and mix that with the electric blankets and the format that could achieve the degree of comfort that is needed. We could even remove kerosene from heating in the homes. So we've dealt with lighting, we've dealt with heating, we've dealt with cooking. Coming to commercial, we are evaluating the use of heat pumps. They're much more efficient than fire stoves, or currently even diesel is used in heating in public buildings or in commercial buildings. And we would launch very soon a pilot around moving all of that heating to a more efficient heat pump based heating solution. Similarly, in agriculture, pumps and motors, we could easily phase that out. On the transport side is the biggest possibility. And directly, hydrogen can, with your fuel cells, could give you a lasting solution to long-range transport. And electric vehicles, we are now piloting with a few electric vehicles. Ladakh is a port place. We are confident of putting in vehicles which will give good performance even in the cold in Ladakh. So those are demand-side initiatives. And what those demand-side initiatives will do is move a lot of the demand onto the electricity grid. And on the supply side, we've seen we could get a mix of wind and solar. So how would it look like? We asked this question. How would it look like if all of this was to come true? And our estimates is that our demand would move up to 80 megawatts. And if we added the induction cook stove, the ones that we intend to revolutionize cooking with, the yellow portion would actually become the peak on top. And if you see, it adds a little more peak to what the usual peak, it aggravates that peak. But this is where the beauty of battery and storage comes in. So if we were to just design a system which produces 185 megawatt wind and 185 megawatt solar, and we've been simplistic not to take all the irregularities of wind and solar, but they are very complementary. And this is a scenario where, let's say, the waters are all frozen and you're not getting any hydro. So if one looks at the aggregated demand curve that I spoke about, that is covered now by the portion that you see in yellow, in light blue, and you could meet all your deficit by taking the deficit is the pink portion, but if you could shave off the light green area, which is the excess that you have, and put it in batteries, you would, or put it in another form of storage through hydrogen, you can actually not only meet the demand, but also have an ecosystem around storage. And that storage could either be in batteries or could be in hydrogen. And that is the question I would leave this audience behind, because we see very significant scope of improving the power reliability by putting batteries behind the meter. Hydrogen fuel cells behind the meter is something that would be a dream, but till that dream comes true, and to make the system in the dark reliable, our solution today is that we put batteries behind the meter, make sure that even if there is weather outages, or there are grid outages, or there are last mile power line outages, they do not reduce the confidence that the consumer will place on some of these appliances. And and therefore we're proposing to put in the solution of batteries distributed on a very large scale and ensure that all of this surplus generation that could happen in solar and wind is moved into these systems and stored for the next day. And even on the worst day, we believe the system will be sufficient to meet the worst power generation scenario and still meet the entire demand of Ladakh. And all that is needed today is a 185 megawatt system. The potential that Ladakh has is 160 gigawatts. So I think we have a huge potential, and wind and solar could also be very, very cheap in Ladakh because sun availability in terms of number of days is the highest in India, and also the intensity of the sun is much, much higher than what we see in the rest of the country. So I think if there's any place to start, and let me open this debate to the rest of my panelists as to how we see this could all pan out. So that's all from my side. Many thanks for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Sood. That was an interesting outline of the future that you envision for Ladakh, and you have made some very good specific suggestions. One question which I had in mind, because I have been looking at the several path-breaking initiatives which EESL has taken in the field of LED bulbs. It has also started a similar initiative in the transport sector, in the air conditioning sector, and also in the vehicles now. So do you see some kind of an initiative like that, either on the drawing board of EESL or something which you anticipate? You talked about induction solar cookers. This is one good example of where large procurement models, sustainable procurement models can bring bring wonders, and then they can make a very large scale transformation within the reach of the people. So do you foresee something like that happening from the side of EESL?
Absolutely, and we would use our strength in demand aggregation and bulk procurement around a range of initiatives. So we are applying the bulbs and the streetlights in Ladakh. That's a learning from other places. But we are actually incubating the induction cook stove in Ladakh. I mean, that would be perhaps the first place where we're proposing to roll out the system. We are also proposing what we call to make the electricity system reliable, storage battery for the lighting and space heating needs for almost 12 hours of the night. So if there was a complete outage, there will be no fear in the mind of the consumer that he will be left in the lurch with no solution of lighting and heating in the night, and will have to therefore go back to his fire stove or some other format. And what we are doing is we are proposing that this system be dispatchable with solar. And if you look at the future, as we increase our penetration of solar in the country, we will have to either increase storage or we will have to bring a lot of appliances which can work on demand response. And by that, if let's say you have a solar cloud on a solar farm, and you lose 30%, 40% of your aggregate capacity, you will have to switch off 30% of your demand at that moment, or bring in 30% of the supply from storage. And our model of distributed storage works cheaper, gives the dispatcher free of cost this demand on a variable tariff, and is also much more sustainable in terms of loss reduction, deferral of grid investments, and some of those other things that come with behind the meter storage. So we are a strong votary of behind the meter storage as ESL. We've led with appliances, and behind appliances, we are also saying let's make these appliances smart. And Ladakh is actually the place where we propose to launch this in a big way.
Thank you so much. Let me now go to Savik and invite him for outlining his vision uh, in terms of the growth of energy consumption, how he would like the energy system to unfold in Ladakh. He has done an extensive study on the carbon neutrality of Ladakh, as I said, in at the behest of the NIDI IO. Savik, Mr. Sood talked about the optimal 250 megawatt capacity of power consumption, the power generating capacity for Ladakh, and 185 of wind, 185 for solar. How do you see these numbers, and whether these numbers match with your projections, and what are your recommendations in this regard? Over to you, Savik.
Thank you, sir. Distinguished fellow panelists. So just let me start sharing my screen.
Yeah, I'll come back to you, Mr. Sood. I think you have a point. Yes, I'll come back to you.
No, absolutely no. I was talking about something else. No,
Okay.
Is my slide visible?
No, not yet.
Okay. So,
Yeah, you're on screen now.
okay. Yes. So, so the presentation that I'm going to make today is drawing a kind of a lot of inputs on the recent work that Mr. Rashmi was referring to, which Terry conducted towards designing the strategy for a carbon neutral Ladakh commissioned by NITI Aayog. Although it won't be possible for me to actually cover the different aspects of it, but at least some of the key elements in terms of where the consumptions would be in the near future, and some of the challenges that we foresee. And this is one of the first of such kind of an exercise undertaken, and there are a lot of opportunities in terms of improving upon it. And that is also a kind of an opportunity wherein we would like to understand your inputs and suggestions in terms of definitely making this transition more effective and win-win for all the stakeholders. So before going into the details of some of the key findings, I would like to just set the context, although like many of these issues are well known to the august audience, but at least just to kind of revisit some of the key elements. So if we look at the key issues when it comes to energy and environment, it is largely like the diesel gensets, which are meeting the energy demand, particularly during the winter seasons. And it has a lot of implications in the local black carbon emission. At the same time, there's a lot of like firewood, which is used for for cooking and heating, and we will see that the significant share of the use of firewood used for in the domestic sector and to some extent the commercial sector. Kerosene, as Mr. Sood had already mentioned, that kerosene has a huge consumption along with firewood in terms of largely the domestic energy requirement, apart from electricity lighting. When it comes to water, because the region has been experiencing a significant increase in the number of tourist footfalls, and a lot of commercial institutions and establishments in the form of hotels have come up in recent times. There's a lot of like groundwater withdrawal, and that has two impacts. In one, in terms of a kind of a less rationalized use of water. At the same time, that there's a lot of pumps which are being currently used, which has significant energy implications. In the agriculture sector, we don't see so much of an impact, but definitely there are a lot of like sporadic, kind of different locations where the agricultural activities are taking place, although it's minimal. But yes, the use of chemical fertilizers as well as water in some of the regions are creating not a kind of a UT level problem, but definitely at a much local level problem. But more importantly, the challenge is the kind of like diversion of the agricultural land that we see, because between 1970 and 2010, we was looking at that almost like 5 to 7% of the neighborhood lands within in the key urban settings, particularly in Kargil and Leh, have been like brought in as a part of its overall development. Tourism and urbanization are some of the key aspects, but it has also implications when it comes to waste management, water supply, and more importantly, sewage water management. So that is an area which has significant water because of the aspect that water needs to be pumped in. At the same time, water needs to be maintained in a fluid state so that it can be supplied through pipelines to different households. And it is envisaged that with maybe more pipe connection, possibly the dependence on groundwater withdrawal and the energy requirement that would be required in terms of extracting the water at different levels can be mitigated to a large extent. And finally, like as I mentioned, urban management between 2003 and 17, we have around 9,400 new buildings coming up, which has a significant impact not only on the built environment, on in terms of like the kind of materials that would have gone in terms of constructing and also bringing those materials from neighboring states. So the embedded footprint in those materials definitely has a significant impact. And as we see, like with more such kind of institutions coming up, and addition to the overall floor space, it will definitely create a lot of like embedded carbon, but at the same time, a lot of waste being generated because of the demolition and new constructions. Now, with this perspective, we did this exercise to develop a kind of a carbon neutral and climate resilient strategy for the region that supports and balances the economic growth and social inclusiveness and preserves the rich ecological diversity. So the C's, some of the key sectors which we had focused on from the demand side, it was the residential, the transport, the commercial, and we have the urban, which in a way also captures the commercial, the defense sector, the agricultural sector, and the tourism sector. And then we have the kind of supply side. Obviously, there would be other supply which we have looked at, but definitely electricity is one of the key issues that we are discussing today, and also being an integral part of this transition. So these are the like kind of 7-8 broad areas that we have looked at. Unfortunately, in the region, the data is scarce, and any kind of like current assessment and future estimation is really challenging, because and with the new UT coming up, because earlier the data was like merged with the Jammu and Kashmir, but now really like kind of taking out the data from the existing Jammu and Kashmir state statistical yearbooks. So that was an initial challenge, but nonetheless, we could break it up to the extent possible where it was making sense and extrapolating it for the next 30 years, because we have the time horizon till 2050. So we have two scenarios, as I mentioned, baseline scenario as well as the alternative scenario, wherein the baseline scenario, we are taking a kind of a bottom-up approach where we are looking at some of the based historical trends and some of the plans that have been identified. And in the alternate scenario, it is more of an aggressive climate neutral scenario, where we have a hybrid bottom and top down approach, where the kind of assumptions we are using in terms of the neutrality is somewhat more, but realistic. But yes, at the same time, it is not really aggressive, like disruptive in terms of what we are discussing today, like a kind of 100% transition towards clean energy. And here still we see a kind of use of DG sets. And as I mentioned, that there's a lot of scope in terms of going even beyond this scenario to capture what Mr. Sood was referring to. Largely the population growth rates, the household growth rates, the rate of urbanization, the tourist footfalls, they are more or less the same across these two scenarios. But what changes in these two scenarios are the demand side management, although the supply side to some extent changes, at least in the electricity sector, where we are assuming a kind of a better utilization of the total renewable energy generation capacity in that region. Now, I don't want to go into the individual sectoral analysis, but to give you a kind of an feel in terms of where the demand and the supply are coming in terms of meeting the demand in the two-year phase, the 2019 as well as the 2050. So as we see that from the demand side, it is largely the residential sector, and this is primarily wherein we see the use of the traditional biomass and kerosene as major energy sources, and predominantly in the rural setting. This is followed by the urban sector as well as the defense sector, and that's a kind of an area wherein I think we need a kind of a little bit of discussion. I don't know to the extent possible that it addresses both the strategic as well as the environmental aspects. And if we look at the kind of contribution coming, it is largely the electricity sector, followed by the gasoline sector, and then we have the other sources including kerosene, diesel, LPG, and so on and so forth. LPG is a source of energy, at least in some of the households, but the connectivity is a major issue wherein most of the households of late, they have been given the permission to in fact order more than one cylinder, so that or two cylinders, so that at least the cost and the time, the lead time which is there in terms of delivering the cylinders in the remote locations get minimized, and they can order in advance. So the demand that we see in the year 2019 was around 9.3 petajoules, but it is going to increase to almost like 18 petajoules by 2050. And urban management or the urban sector would be the largest consumer of energy in the alternative sector, in the alternate scenario. Similarly, the kind of like energy which is expected to come under the alternate scenario, it is again the diesel. As you can see that the kerosene and other sources are falling, but diesel, why? Because here we are assuming that in the defense sector there are no transitions. So that's an area which possibly we can revisit, and we would be able to like in fact further reduce the overall carbon footprint in terms of making or greening the entire defense operations in that region. So if we look at the net GHG accounting, so we undertook a kind of an overall inventory assessment for across various sectors, and you can see that it's almost like 600 kilotons of emission which we see. But if we look at it from the perspective of growth, then by 2032, possibly the current carbon stock would be exhausted and it would be considered as neutral. So it's now carbon negative, we become like neutral by 2032, and then maybe beyond that one, with no more initiative, it is definitely going to increase. But this one can consider that these are based on some past tense and certain assumptions. But that doesn't mean that situation may actually even deteriorate further, whether the kind of growth that we see between now and 2030, maybe even faster, and we can see the kind of neutrality achieving even before 2030. But nonetheless, this is a kind of an exercise to give a understanding that where we are and the kind of neutrality exists, and the tipping point, and when it goes off. And then we have the kind of like an aggressive carbon sequestration, wherein we have the alternate ways of increasing the overall future stock, which goes to almost like 1.9 to 2 million tons. But more importantly, the energy consumption in the economy, in fact, in the region, in fact, reduces significantly by almost 50-60% because of the various interventions that we are looking at. So it's the demand side management that we are largely looking at in the transport sector, in the agricultural sector, as well as in the residential sector. So even with these interventions, if we are able to really continue, then possibly the kind of scenario that we see is that it will remain to be as carbon neutral even till 2050. Now, then we identified like 5 major thematic areas of interventions, and I'm going to touch upon like some of them. And the first one being the hydrogen as a source of energy transition, particularly the green energy transition. So if we look at the use of green hydrogen that is produced locally, can be really promising from the perspective that it is local, as well as the cost would be very minimal, particularly when it comes to the fact that it is being generated through the green process, not the traditional the gray or the blue one that we quite often talk about these days. Further, there is a need for to explore that how it can be delivered at a kind of a least cost manner. And one of the best applications that we are looking at in the hydrogen sector is largely in the transport sector, and both in the civil transport as well as for the defense applications. Now, this is a big challenge in order to preserve the pristine and ecologically sensitive local environment. But given the limits of direct and electrification, particularly in remote areas, and the associated challenges of the maintenance, the green hydrogen has the potential to overcome some of the fundamental issues. In fact, better utilization of the biomass, maybe for other purposes, and definitely in terms of addressing the ecological sanctity in the region. We do have the National Hydrogen Mission. There is this new National Biohydrogen Mission, which the Department of Biotechnology is talking about. So I think it provides a kind of a very unique opportunity to have both a central kind of a supply mechanism, but making maybe use of some of the traditional practices, including the dry toilets as a source of methane production, largely in the distribution. And if there is an opportunity for manufacturing hydrogen, even that is, but the scale definitely is an issue. But obviously, that needs to be explored in terms of how it can be achieved. The second aspect is definitely we are talking about the electricity supply. So Ladakh has a very rich source of renewable energy. And as Mr. Sood mentioned, that it has a massive solar potential of around 60 gigawatt of solar, and 35 gigawatt in Kargil, in Leh, as well as 25 gigawatt in Kargil. So Ladakh has an annual average of 325 days of sunny days, thus making it one of the largest regions in the world having such high irradiation. So the Leh district, that was estimated to generate almost 6 to 12 kilowatt hours per square kilometer, and the capacity utilization factor in the region can be easily assumed to be double than what we normally experience in the region. And at the same time, the wind energy, although we haven't covered that one because of the fact that we got the understanding that the density is relatively less. But yes, discussion with some of the other stakeholders, we feel that wind has a lot of potential, and to the tune of 100 gigawatt. And definitely along the main transmission lines, if we are able to harness this entire wind and connect it with the transmission lines, and not only it can be utilized in meeting the requirements as well as exporting it to the other state. In fact, we have also considered storage of around 100 megawatt hour of electricity, and it makes appropriate sense in terms of even meeting the peak demand, particularly which is generated during the evening and early morning. So that can also be addressed. So back of the metering, which Mr. Sood was talking about, is also feasible in terms of ensuring that possibly a kind of local manufacturing can be established. There would be opportunities of using decentralized electricity access in some of the remote locations that might be almost 10% of the total households. But definitely, at least it would be better than the current model, because most of these remote households, they do have a solar panels, but because of poor maintenance, they are not able to really use it on a continuous basis. So there is therefore 1.5 years, and then it can kind of it moves away because they move away again, back to the traditional biomass, which is again making no kind of sense so far the neutrality is concerned. In the transport sector, what we have assumed, as I mentioned, is the large electrification in the two-wheeler space, but in the four-wheeler space, but a combination of both electrification as well as hybrid But in the light commercial vehicles, we are considering hybrids, but when it comes to buses, it is electric. But we need to understand that whether transforming from the current fuel mix to the electric mix and then going to the hydrogen mix, or directly like kind of leapfrog to hydrogen, makes more sense is something that needs to be studied in greater details. Well, some of the so that I mentioned about the transport sector. We do also have the interventions in terms of ensuring that how we are able to make agriculture having a very sustainable agricultural practices in Ladakh. Greenhouse effects are currently already in place, but there are incentive mechanisms that can be introduced to increased adoption of these practices, at least in some of the lower lying regions, which are like more conducive to and the environment is more conducive to agricultural practices. And then we have the climate resilient agriculture, but at the same time the urban development, because the solar passive heating, which is currently almost nil, but if we consider around 10 to 15% of the total built environment that will have solar passive heating, it is definitely going to have a huge impact on the overall energy demand in the region. And finally, we are talking about the adoption of sustainable tourism practices, because tourism is almost like 2 to 3 folds of the total population in the region. So it will definitely have a lot of impact in terms of not only the direct energy consumption, but also the indirect energy consumption through the water and other services that are provided to those people who are coming not only from India and outside. So let me end here, and I'll be more than happy, sir, to take any comments or questions for that matter. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Souvik, very much. This was an wide-ranging presentation covering a number of sectors, and you talked of a hybrid model of carbon neutral strategy, both bottom up and top down. In a way, this is a variation on what Mr. Sood earlier talked about, a combination of energy supply and demand management. Both have to be approached from the two sides to really to be effective. And I saw an important difference. Of course, I would like to discuss it towards the end, but you emphasized a multi-sectoral approach to focus on each sector, and it has its own particularities, and then develop solutions around that sector. You have talked of 6 important areas of intervention, but you did begin with hydrogen as the most important resource. Of course, you talked of renewables as well. Mr. Sood talked of renewables as the primary vehicle of this transformation, and he was emphasizing the battery, the storage. You have talked of an alternative fuel. So I do see a difference here in the approach, but we'll take it up towards the end. But this is interesting. Let me now go to Mr. Panda. He happens to represent the largest, one of the largest energy corporations in the country and perhaps in the world as well. And then it's very important that they have started diversifying into the area of renewables. So this is an very welcome signal. And we would like to listen to him as to how NTPC looks at this entire business of investment, future investment in the renewable energy, and more particularly, what role can NTPC play in Ladakh? Mr. Panda.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Rasmi, and especially for kind words for NTPC. Currently, NTPC name do come in the top 10 global utilities, not the number 1. However, we want to be more than the largest one. We want to be a leading player. And when you say leading, it means on the ESG front, everywhere. We are the number 1. Coming back to Ladakh. Now, I will give my perspective in a different way. When you say carbon-free Ladakh, which essentially means that how can we find an alternative source of energy for Ladakh? And then also I'll deal with this. Why do you speak about carbon-free Ladakh? Why not carbon-free Andaman or carbon-free Lakshadweep? What is that specialty about Ladakh for which Prime Minister has said that we all are discussing that, and why it is so? Why it is so difficult and why it is so important? So let us go one by one. Any of us who has gone to Leh, I mean, immediately this would hit you like a wall of bricks. Maybe because of my NTPC background, I tend to look at things from energy perspective, but this is what hits you. You get down from the airport and you just see the mass of cars, buses around. So much so that hardly there is any walking space when you come out of the airport to the city. And I'll start from there. So there is a madness the way the taxis are running. And why they are running? Because there is a heavy rush of tourists. And when do the tourists come, where do they stay? They stay in hotels. So therefore, there is a cascading effect of the energy everywhere. So let us go one by one. There is absolutely large number of vehicles, and mostly they're diesel driven, whether it is for domestic sector or for the city average people, or it is for the defense use. So for mobility, all these vehicles use diesel, and the consumption of diesel is going up and up and up. Why? Because more and more number of tourists are coming. So if we want to make all this free of diesel or free of carbon, what we need to do and why it is so important? It is, and we are not talking about the same breath about diesel versus hydrogen or anything when we talk about Andaman or Lakshadweep, because the nearest source of diesel for Ladakh comes from either Mathura refinery or those refineries around this place. So at least for a liter of diesel to reach Ladakh, say Leh, which is the capital, it has to travel the distance of 700 kilometers, climb a height of at least 3,500 meters. So that's the logistic involved in every liter of diesel or petrol that I carry from Delhi as a plains to that city like Leh. I'm spending so much, and what I am getting? Now, as you know, so Leh, and there are many valleys like this, which means there is a population staying in a closed location, which is bounded by very, very top hills all around them. So all that carbon dioxide, all that smoke, all that soot, carbon black, that stays there. That's the problem. Now, if I want to deal with this, so first I have to find out how all these vehicles can run, either through electric means or through hydrogen. I do not have any other way. Now, mind it, the temperature of Ladakh often, and probably all of us aware that all electric cars, electric buses, when we are operating at a temperature like minus 15, minus 20, minus 25, the battery discharges very fast and the capacity reduces to as low as 40 to 50%. Meaning, a car which runs, say, 100 kilometers in a single charge in Delhi will only travel 50 kilometers. So therefore, electric cars, electric buses are not a sustainable solution. The only alternative is a hydrogen car or hydrogen buses. Now, when I buy a car, I don't think twice. I just go to a showroom, I select a car and brings it and then drives it. In Leh, if I am considering hydrogen cars, hydrogen buses, I need to have a hydrogen filling station. So I cannot depend on petrol, diesel, kerosene, anything. So there has to be a hydrogen station. And how that hydrogen has to come? Now, I cannot use, so to say, a gray hydrogen or blue hydrogen, because I am still generating carbon dioxide somewhere. Now, again, we all of us know that whether I am emitting 1 kg carbon dioxide in Delhi or Ladakh or in Scotland, it is all the same. So I need to have an energy source which is not derived from under the ground, say coal or petroleum products. It has to come from either wind or solar or water. So my options are limited. But out of these 3 limited options, I need to generate hydrogen, store it to a pressure of at least 350 bar or 700 bar, and then fill them into the vehicle. So NTPC is precisely doing that. NTPC is establishing a hydrogen filling station at Leh. For providing power for electrolysis, we are establishing a standalone 1.25 megawatt power plant. And then I am arranging hydrogen buses. Now the battle doesn't stop here. Some numbers I'll share with you. Now, if I want to run a diesel bus, I need to spend 60 rupees a kilometer. But if I am operating hydrogen buses, I have to spend 600 rupees a kilometer, which means after arranging that green electricity, hydrogen station, then I have to fund for extra 10 times increase in the cost. So, like at Leh, NTPC will run 5 hydrogen buses. More the kilometers these buses will run, more money I have to feed in. That is what we are trying to do. That is NTPC investment. Now, why NTPC is doing this investment? Now, operating hydrogen buses at such heights, at so low temperature, can I operate my vehicles with a medium, with an energy source, which is not influenced by low temperature, which doesn't have any carbon. That is what NTPC wants to prove in a location like Leh. And once I am successful, once I see that, yes, hydrogen buses can run nicely, so the numbers should grow up. And once the number grow up, then from civilian to defense, and there are almost 1 lakh trucks flying every day. Just imagine the kind of logistic involved in feeding diesel for this 1 lakh vehicles. And we want to convert that to hydrogen. And when we operate at that scale, and when we say we, it doesn't mean NTPC. Anybody can run them. And once we operate at that level, the cost of green hydrogen, the cost of hydrogen buses, the cost of that special infrastructure, that will come down. Till such time, somebody has to invest in making these things run. So that is what NTPC is doing. Then comes the cooking part. Now, few speakers before me, they touched on the kind of induction cooker and things like that. All my listeners who are listening, you'll actually feel sad when you know that temperature comes to below minus 25 degrees centigrade and electricity is given to the villagers maximum 1 kilowatt connection, and that too not more than 4 hours. Just imagine what these poor people must be doing. They burn firewood, they burn something inside their thatched houses. There is every possibility that that will catch fire. The smoke fills the house. Kids, women, everybody who is in that house, they are continuously exposed to this thick smoke, particularly in the winter time. Now, what NTPC is trying to do, because NTPC knows in some of the locations, the grid may not reach, electricity grid may not reach within next 5 years. Now, this is a responsibility, social responsibility of NTPC and of everybody to see that all citizens are getting electricity at least major part of the day, for the kids to study and the women to cook food and to run the normal household jobs. NTPC wants to supply 3 kilowatt round-the-clock power to all those villages which may not see electricity in next 5 years' time. And right now, what I am doing, again, I am using DG sets. I am supplying power from DG sets, and you'll be surprised, the cost of electricity comes to around 40 rupees a unit. So I stay in Delhi. So I am paying power at a rate of say 7 to 8 rupees a unit. And there it is 40 rupees. Of course, the villagers cannot pay per unit 40 rupees. So somebody has to pay that. So Ladakh government is doing that. So what we are wanting, that we will establish a system which will operate on hydrogen, not dependent on any of these vagaries which are affected by environmental condition. Yet the villages, they get electricity. Now the point is, why I am not talking about other cities, other locations in India, why Ladakh? Because first of all, at that height, all surrounded by very thick mountains, electricity cannot reach. And whatever skeletal infrastructure I have, I cannot supply today more than 50 to 60 megawatt of power. And that too only for Leh, city like Leh, not all. So for facilitating all these villagers, we want to supply electricity, that is through hydrogen. You will be again surprised to know that the schools are almost down by 5 to 6 months. And so also most of the educational institute. So just say the kids, they are bereft of the education and comfortable living. So next is the heating part. So I touched this part in the beginning. So when all that tourists come, where do they stay? They stay in hotel. I also stayed in a hotel. And I just looked at how this water is heated. And they use very systematically heavy equipments based on kerosene boilers. So we use kerosene to heat water, and that water is supplied not for your bathing or something like that, but for central heating of all these hotel rooms. All the government offices are heated that way. And they all use diesel or kerosene. Now, there is a beautiful thing about hydrogen. When we have stored hydrogen and you make electricity through fuel cell, almost half of that energy goes as heat, waste heat. What we want to do, we capture that heat, give that heat to educational institutes, schools, offices, hotels to the extent possible, so that my use of kerosene for any use, either lighting or heating, is completely eliminated. And that is why we want to make a system. We want to start pilots, make it successful, so that anybody who sees there is a chance, they can exploit that commercial opportunities. But it is on NTPC being a energy utility to support our another chunk of our own country, where my brother and sisters are staying, have the same luxury of having electricity and the mobility. If we do systematically, then I am very confident. At least in next 10 years, the level of diesel vehicles, the level of kerosene use would follow below half of what is present now. So that is what I would like to say right now about carbon neutral Ladakh and role of NTPC. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Panda. That was an extremely enlightening session. You talked of the possible use of hydrogen in all the areas of possible interventions in the area of transport, in cooking and heating, wherever there is a need of energy and growing need of energy in Ladakh. You have suggested the use of fuel cells and use of hydrogen-based energy systems. Of course, this makes tremendous sense, but there are other speakers before you who have spoken of storage, batteries, and those are the other possible solutions in terms of transition. Where is this emphasis we should place currently on, in a short-term or in a long-term strategy? Should we place the emphasis on the energy storage, or should we straight away go for fuel cell-based technology for all kinds of possible applications in different areas of energy generation, cooking, heating, transport, everywhere? It makes good sense if the entire economy is based on hydrogen. It brings scale, economies of scale, it brings the efficiency. But one thing which is not certain, and maybe towards the end we will talk about it, what is the economics of all this? How does it play out in terms of, how does it compare with the current costs of storage of energy or producing energy from renewables? Does the fuel cell technology, is it possible to, even if it succeeds on a pilot basis, can it succeed on scale? Can you do it on scale? You talked of the hydrogen-based vehicles, and the number of vehicles is going to multiply in future. So this is, if the economics works, there is a possibility of the models which ESL has employed in other equipment. It can be done here as well. So it will be interesting to hear your views on how the economics and the costing of the energy in this sector is going to play out. Let me first hear the other speaker of today's panel, Mr. Parag Vyas, who I'm sure with his rich experience of having worked as an investor, as a practitioner in the field of energy, not only in India, but outside India in other countries. With his experience, how does he see this role of hydrogen playing out vis-a-vis other forms of energy systems and energy transition, and what role this can play in Ladakh? Mr. Vyas, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Rashmi, for your invitation to this panel. And can I just say it's a pleasure to hear the discussions from my fellow and distinguished panel members. That's been very interesting for me. I'll just give a brief introduction to myself and where I'm coming from, and then I thought I'd share my thoughts with you on the techno-economic considerations for hydrogen in remote regions like Ladakh, and also with a focus on transport, because we've been discussing that. And what I hope I can get across is a discussion of the why, the what, and the how of hydrogen, I think, looking at transport in Ladakh. Okay, but just a little bit about me. So, and I think you introduced me at the beginning, but I'm an executive with over 25 years of experience with corporations like Rolls-Royce, like General Electric, and like the Greco. I'm also a council member of a body called the Regulatory Horizons Council. And this is an independent expert body that advises the UK government, Department of Business and Energy, on regulatory reforms. And we've looked at things like fusion energy and drones, and we will be looking at hydrogen very shortly. Hydrogen is gaining huge significance in the UK and across Europe. And so the regulatory reforms needed for the safe and rapid adoption of hydrogen technologies is something that's of concern to everyone, okay, both in the UK and internationally. But let me move on now to the real discussion here, the why, the what, and the how. Let's start with the why. Why hydrogen in transport, and why remote regions like Ladakh? Okay, so let's start with the why hydrogen in transport. The thing is, whenever we want to look at zero carbon transport, the first thing that comes to mind is battery electric vehicles. And it's probably true to say this is the simplest and most cost-effective technology that we have today. And you only need to look around the world. You need to look at the likes of Tesla, or the big automotive OEMs, the likes of Renault or Volkswagen, and they are having a lot of success commercializing battery electric vehicles. whereas hydrogen electric vehicles are somewhat less mature technically and more expensive. But I think what we need to focus on is maybe less away from passenger vehicles and towards what we would probably consider heavy duty vehicles, because batteries have a very low energy density. They're very heavy, not only they're expensive, but they're very heavy. So anytime we want to travel a long distance or carry an appreciable amount of freight or an appreciable number of passengers, the mass of the batteries becomes a burden. Basically, the heavier the battery, the less freight you can carry. So for heavy duty vehicles of all types, a better fuel, an energy dense fuel like hydrogen becomes competitive and attractive. Okay, not just on a cost basis, but a cost per kilometer or a cost per ton of freight transported basis. And this applies to all forms of transport. So whether it's off-road, agricultural vehicles, industrial vehicles, whether it's on-road trucks and heavy duty, heavy goods vehicles, or whether it's in fact trains. So remote parts of Europe, like Scotland, where the lines are very expensive to electrify, hydrogen trains are under consideration, and even boats. So I know that Ladakh may be less relevant, but for a maritime nation like the UK, displacing diesel from boats is definitely, or fossil fuels from boats, definitely on the agenda. So we have why transport, hydrogen transport, why remote regions? And I think this comes down to cost. Cost competitiveness is going to drive hydrogen. Cost competitiveness against diesel, the fossil fuels, and cost competitiveness against the cost of upgrading the electrical infrastructure. Okay, so these are the two factors that will drive the economics. And I think, so coming back to costs of diesel and fossil fuels, we heard very eloquently from Mr. Panda the logistical issues involved with transporting diesel fuel to remote regions. And that transport and logistic cost is actually quite a high fraction of the delivered price of diesel. So it already means that if we're in any hydrogen application where we're wanting to displace a diesel fuel or a fossil fuel, because diesel or fossil fuel costs are more expensive in remote regions, it's going to be more competitive there from the get-go, okay? So payback will always be quicker if the diesel price is higher, wherever you go in the world. The second factor is, if we want to achieve and get to net zero and a zero carbon economy, we start with the electrical infrastructure we have today, okay, which is supplying existing demands, existing electrical loads. But net zero implies decarbonizing both transport and heating and cooking. So if we look in, for example, the UK or across Europe, heating is traditionally supplied through natural gas. So for the UK, coming from the North Sea, and for homes more in remoter regions off the natural gas grid, then liquid petroleum gas is the fuel. Displacing fossil fuel by electricity, especially for climates, northern European climates, displacing heating implies maybe a doubling of electrical power capacity going into the homes. Because we consume, maybe a country like, or a region like Scotland, maybe 50% of the energy consumption and 50% of the carbon emissions are due to domestic and commercial space heating. It's a phenomenal amount of energy and actually can't just be supplied with the existing electrical grid. So the real question is, what is the cost of doubling the electrical capacity? That's transmission, distribution, transformers, substations, and all the way down to domestic and commercial buildings. That's a huge infrastructure upgrade. So the question there is then, can hydrogen be a more cost-effective energy vector to do to produce the heating and cooking that we need. And one thing that Panitech is doing is we're actually pursuing a project in a rural community in Scotland, and this we think is one of the first of the kind across the whole of Europe. It'll be a net zero hydrogen powered community where we will supply the electrical load, but also the heating and transport needs for a farm and a domestic rural community. So that means supplying hydrogen for hydrogen domestic vehicles, hydrogen agro-industrial vehicles, tractors, loading machines and so on, hydrogen for use with hydrogen gas boilers to provide hot water and heating, and also cooking. And then electricity is coming from local renewable electricals, wind turbines and solar. Okay, so that's the kind of pioneering project I think we need, and looks replicable across the world if we take the different modules and building blocks there. Okay, so we discussed why. How about what do we need to deliver that hydrogen? And the obvious answer is we need two things first. What do we need to produce the hydrogen, and what do we need to use that hydrogen? And the obvious answer for the what is what do we need to produce the hydrogen? The obvious answer is an electrolyzer. So a wind or solar powered hydrogen electrolyzer will produce green hydrogen. Okay, and the technology has been around for more than 100 years, namely alkaline electrolyzer. So very well established technology. The costs and efficiencies are well understood, but we see also right now a lot of innovation happening. Okay, firstly with the growth or development of PEM electrolyzers, and part of the proposition with PEM electrolyzers is their ability to load follow. So if you have variable output renewable generation, PEM electrolyzers are very well suited to follow that load and produce hydrogen. What Panitech we are doing is we're working with a Canadian company, an electrolyzer company, and they've developed a novel cell architecture using alkaline electrolyzers, and they are combining both the longevity and cost advantages of alkaline with the load following advantages of PEM. And this is something that we hope we will be able to trial then soon in Scotland. And we have a product technology roadmap that means that it becomes very competitive in terms of cost, efficiency, and stack life within a period of 5 years. Okay, so we know that the electrolyzer space is technology space, definitely very innovative, a lot of R&D investment going in, and the technology is coming along very fast. And for me, in my experience, it really resembles the early days of solar and wind, where the initial costs were very high, but a lot of companies started to innovate and develop, and we saw really rapid drops in price, increases in reliability, and improvements in efficiency 20 years ago, say, in Europe. Okay, so the what, how do we produce, and the what, how do we, what do we do to use that, especially in vehicles? And I think part of the discussion is hydrogen vehicles is actually very interesting. There are at least 3 different options to get there. And I really think it's interesting to look at a stepping stone or intermediate option to hydrogen vehicles. And that is retrofit diesel hydrogen dual fuel vehicles. And the reason I say that is what's interesting. First of all, it's technically feasible and easily and relatively straightforward and cost effective to add hydrogen injection equipment onto an existing diesel vehicle. So the good news is if you have that vehicle, you don't need to scrap it to go to hydrogen. What you can do is blend hydrogen in to the engine and maybe displace up to about 20% of the diesel that's used on a journey. So this gives you an advantage. If you already have hydrogen, you can start to use your existing fleet of vehicles. They don't become stranded assets, and you can get an immediate diesel saving impact. And you can spread that across a large number of, a large fleet of vehicles. And if you actually run out of hydrogen, it's not an issue. You can go back to 100% diesel as a backup. So this is something that we see already in Europe. I know, for example, so close to where I live in Glasgow, they're having hydrogen dual fuel municipal trucks, where the hydrogen is coming from a large wind farm outside Glasgow, which has something like 20 to 30% curtailment. So the electricity is supplied at zero marginal cost. We're seeing hydrogen boats in the Netherlands and in Belgium, hydrogen retrofit dual fuel agricultural vehicles in North America, for example, in Canada as well. Diesel hydrogen retrofit trucks with hydrogen as a service. So this is an established technology and perhaps something to consider as a stepping stone to the full hydrogen economy in a cost-effective and low-risk way. Okay. Beyond that, there are two other routes to hydrogen vehicles. One is taking the internal combustion engine, but going to 100% hydrogen. And this is already a well-established technology. I do remember working back in Germany, maybe 10 years ago now. BMW, they ran a fleet of 7 series cars, 100% hydrogen, onboard hydrogen storage. They had hydrogen fueling stations. The technology exists, but perhaps it didn't get so much traction, so to speak, because the most efficient solution would be hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. So hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle is basically an electric vehicle where the electricity is supplied by a hydrogen fuel cell. And it's fair to say we see a lot of trials of things like hydrogen buses in Europe, but it's fair to say the commercialization is not there yet because, one, the technology is still not fully mature. The trials we see are R&D or pilot demonstrators and not commercial trials. And secondly, the capex costs of these buses, it is very high. So they are only viable if they receive a high subsidy or R&D grant to make it affordable. So the outlook for that, I think, definitely there's a lot of work to be done, and it's a solution, but it's perhaps something for the long term, whereas dual fuel retrofit is something that can be done and deployed today. So we've talked about the why, the what. Now let's just a little bit discuss the how. What's the route to getting to a hydrogen economy? And I think there are two things we need to do there, stepping stones. One, we do actually need to create the market. Okay, and then secondly, pilot demonstrators are definitely going to be important, both technically and for investment. So what do I mean by creating the market? And we have examples of this across Europe. In the early days, 20 years ago, for example, there was very much the start of the trend towards clean tech and the green economy. And government incentives were needed to kickstart and develop the technology and to get companies to invest in R&D. And we saw a very successful example of that when the German government, I think this is a really good example, about 20 years ago, introduced a feed-in tariff for solar. Back then, it was something like of the order of 50 euro cents per kilowatt hour you would get if you had a solar panel feeding into the grid. And we know since then how the business investors scaled up and the costs came rapidly, fell rapidly. Solar eventually hit grid parity, and now I think in India, solar costs are below 3 US cents per kilowatt hour easily. Okay, so solar has become really effective, but it was introduced and scaled up by businesses invested in because of the initial feed-in tariff. And we've seen something similar in the United Kingdom with offshore wind. So again, initially, a very expensive renewable energy technology. So the cost of installing wind turbines offshore is logistically, it's very difficult. The turbines have to be bigger, they have to withstand corrosion and higher forces. But what we've seen through a mechanism called contracts for difference, which is again another kind of incentive scheme that's structured around forward contracts or futures contracts, we've seen costs for UK offshore wind fall to below 5 pence per kilowatt hour, being competitive with the wholesale price of electricity. Okay, so it's really, I'm making the point that it's these incentives that attract companies to invest in the technologies and project developers that to develop and learn and gain experience in developing the projects to scale up, which gets the cost down. And there's a chicken and egg situation there. So this is something to really consider in the context of India and doing business in India. The last incentive measure is essentially the other way around. It's actually carbon taxes. So carbon taxes will penalize fossil fuel CO2 emissions. And we know today something like a carbon tax, an EU carbon tax through the EU emissions trading scheme of around 30 to 50 euros per ton. We think that that will make hydrogen competitive and subsidy-free, essentially, by 2030, just purely due to the fact of the deflationary historic trends of renewable energy and the development of electrolyzer technology going forward. So at 30 euros per ton carbon tax, this is certainly something that will make hydrogen viable within 10 years, okay? So certainly creating the market, it needs some consideration of the incentives. The other part is de-risking the technology. De-risking the technology allows for both the technology to develop, but also for investors to have certainty what can be delivered, what can be worked, and to be able to finance future projects. And we're very keen in Panatech of doing pilot demonstrators. I think this will be something very important for India. I'll give you the example, the fuel cell bus programs around Europe are really uncovering technical challenges and difficulties, but helping to improve and improve the technology for fuel cell buses. We need something like that as well in India, in Ladakh. And this will be important in bringing together and trialing the business cases, the supply chain, the installers, the contractors, the technologies, because for sure there will be environmental conditions, ambient conditions, and use cases that we don't know about because this technology is so new. Okay, so just to conclude, we see hydrogen is incredibly important politically, all across Europe and North America, in the regions and nations, and even at the European Union. And we now see in India exactly the same. And I think the driving and influence factors are very similar across the globe. The need to decarbonize, the difficulty of decarbonizing transport and heating, the costs involved of fossil fuels and upgrading the electrical infrastructure, and the opportunity that comes through new technology and R&D and technology investment. And I think there is definitely a really good opportunity in Ladakh for hydrogen based on the costs of the logistical cost of transporting and delivering fossil fuels, and also the challenges of upgrading electrical infrastructure. And so supplying electricity locally with embedded generation through solar and wind, for example, and local hydrogen can be cost effective and a shortcut in terms of time to getting to low carbon hydrogen, low carbon economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vyas. Thanks a lot. You have made an excellent presentation on all the aspects of how hydrogen can be used as the lever for decarbonization and also to meet the energy needs. And you've explained it very well. You of course underscored the fact that it's important to create a market. It's important to create a right framework of incentives to be able to move in that direction. And some of the existing costs are a good, compelling reason for us to already start investing in that area. Mr. Panda did talk about, the huge logistic cost of moving petrol or diesel from the refineries to Ladakh. And that itself, I don't know whether the delivered cost of diesel and petrol in Ladakh, we are building that cost into the final price or not. But certainly there is an economic reason. There is a case for building this cost into the final delivered price, so that the solutions that you're all pointing out become viable, economically viable, and implementable. When ultimately all the policies have to be tested on the fulcrum of their implementability, their economic viability. Ultimately, somebody has to pay for it. So it's important to create the right market conditions and to let them build up the synergy through a host of market-based initiatives as well as government regulatory interventions. So thank you very much for giving us this range of choices. With these speakers, we have come to the end of the session. I haven't received any questions in the chat box as yet, but I had a few questions in my mind, which I thought, and then you are welcome to come up with your own inputs on that. One question, Mr. Vyas, you were talking about replacement of the natural gas, the based heating systems with hydrogen in the European countries and the Western countries. Of course, the heating is not a very important requirement elsewhere, but certainly in Ladakh. Ladakh, it's a very important consideration. So, but here in Ladakh, we have to look at the primary the requirements. The energy profile, as Souvik was pointing out, the transport sector, the residential and commercial sector, the energy requirements are going to grow very high, because even now the Ladakh, the rural population is the largest, and the problem is the huge, the lack of grid. So therefore, ultimately, we have to look for something which is decentralized in nature, which can be maintained easily at the community level. So what do you think in terms of an integrated solution for the communities and the households in Ladakh, in the rural region of Ladakh, where they require heating, they require cooking, they require electricity? Do you think hydrogen can fit in there? And what kind of solution would you suggest for them?
Yes, so I think hydrogen can. So here's my thinking on this. So in rural communities, you may have a grid, but the grid will be weak, and that's just a factor of geography. Because if you are at the end of a long grid line, then you'll have a limited capacity, and you'll probably see higher grid instability or voltage fluctuations or frequency fluctuations. So this makes it difficult to use more electricity or to supply more electricity and extend the grid out towards a village or a town. One solution to that is having embedded generation local to the community. Okay, so solar, for example. Okay, but you still will face a lot of technical challenge to put that at the end of a weak grid line, and that's because of technical factors like solar electricity typically doesn't provide inertia, doesn't stabilize the voltage and frequency of the grid. You'll have grid capacity fluctuations. Okay, so it's not straightforward to suddenly put lots of renewable electricity generation at a rural point in a weak grid. This is why people start to discuss microgrid solutions. Okay, one opportunity is actually co-locate the solar with the electrolyzer. Okay, and together they actually provide renewable electricity and storage. Okay, so this is what we're actually doing on the farm, or want to pursue on the farm in Scotland. It's essentially that use case. It is how to supply local energy. You know, how to displace transport and heating or cooking or other fuel uses locally when you're at the end of a weak grid. Okay, and so co-locating, in this case, wind, but in Ladakh, I could imagine solar, and co-locating that with an electrolyzer helps you manage those fluctuations, store the fuel locally, and it's much easier then to distribute through fueling stations or through standard hydrogen cylinder tanks or whatever you want. Mr. Rash, you're on mute.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Vyas. Mr. Sood, let me come back to you now. You had emphasized that the batteries behind every appliance, every equipment needs to have its own storage batteries, so as to be, easily used. I mean, it can be used easily and it can be replaced and easily. The two other speakers, or rather, including Savik, all three of them have talked of hydrogen. So, what is your take on this in terms of transport, which is the primary, the sector that is growing fastest, and then obviously we have to come up with a new fleet of buses and cars and the transport systems based either on hydrogen or some other system, or on electric battery system. What is your final take on this after having listened to these speakers?
So, yeah, I mean, I think wonderful insights I gathered today about the Ladakh system. And yeah, there's a lot of food for thought in what the other speakers have said. But let me give some rejoinders back on some of the situation in Ladakh. Ladakh has, yes, been an area where there have been difficulties with the power system, but it is today 53,000 households have been electrified. At this moment, the number of count of households electrified out of a total population of 2.74 lakhs, which means that you're nearing 90% access of electricity. Yes, there is Nubra Valley, there is Ansar Valley, where we're still on standalone systems, and there is plan for electrifying. So Ladakh is not a system which has a very recent deployment of electricity. Second, I would say, is the custom and culture of Ladakh a little different from the West. They're very frugal people, and they would move to passive heating rather than the gas kind of heating, very heavy heating, which happen in the West. Of course, hotels, me and you, when we go, we will all have very high expectations of what heating we would need. And therefore, I see room for, we're proposing heat pumps, but if heat pumps versus hydrogen is a better source, I'm willing to change my mind. But at this moment, we've evaluated all of the technologies. And at this moment today, especially in grid-connected areas, we can easily go for that kind of solution. In terms of augmentation, let me also explain. UK has a very active plan of augmentation of its network, and augmentation is possible at very, very low costs of the transmission system by doing what I call HTLS lines and high capacity conductors. That's something I sold in India because in my last job, and it is a very easy solution to put more power. If you've determined that the electrical route and the battery route is going to be economically the cheapest, because electricity down to 2 rupees a unit from solar and wind, and battery, which gives 80% of the energy back, is a very powerful economic combination. Now, if you have to beat it with IC engine, You put it through the hydrogen route and put it back through the IC engine, the efficiencies are, the physics doesn't work with it. And the economics will be a consequence of the physics. So, yes, of course, investment at scale will bring a lot of these costs down, but it will not change the physics and the economics of conversion. Will there be a room? Yes, for long-range buses, for buses which need very high density, for even commercial vehicles, which may not be able to tip the scale. I absolutely agree that that's an insight which is very, very useful. I learned about it today. But when I come to the residential sector today is either on firewood. It's a very frugal use. It's free, but when you have to pay for a commercial resource, be it electricity, be it LPG, be it any format, people become very, very conscious of the use and have a budget for their use. So what could we deliver in that budget is the question. And my proposal was with electric cook stoves, because their efficiencies are much higher than LPG-based cook stoves. You could half the bill for a poor household. And that is a very powerful, and you could do this without giving any subsidies. Today, you could, today, if you look at the sector in Ladakh, yes, the costs are very high because power is coming from very far and it is coming from a lot of sources. But look at the embedded potential of Ladakh. If India is giving power at 2 rupees now, Ladakh has 20% more potential than the rest of India. So the prices can drop even further.
Mr. Sood, we have to conclude now, so I think we have to move.
Yeah, I think I made a lot of the points, but let me conclude by saying that at this moment, if I was to do a large-scale conversion program, battery-based systems, or yes, you need to store behind the meter. If there is a solution to store behind the meter which meets the battery cost, we would change our religion, and we would go with that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Since we have just about 5 minutes left, and before concluding, I would like to go back to Mr. Panda for that one final question on how does he see the cost, the economics of the hydrogen-based buses and the transport system which he was talking about. NTPC is taking up pilots in this. So how do you foresee the future here, Mr. Panda, in 1 minute?
So one easy response would be, the more the scale, the prices should come down. Number one, the way electrolyzers technology is improving, the cost would be down. And third, most importantly, when hydrogen buses, electrolyzers are made in India, the cost is going to be lower than 40% of the present cost. So that would make it very much feasible.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Let me thank all the panelists once again for the excellent insights, outstanding presentations, and we have had a very rich discussion. Souvik, I'm sorry I cannot come back to you for the final question, but you have summarized in a way, you have pointed to the way forward, that we need a multi-sectoral strategy, looking at each specific sector and its specific needs. And perhaps we will have to look at a combination of battery-based solutions and hydrogen-based solutions in the short term. But ultimately, we have to move towards a hydrogen-based economy. That is the sense that I'm getting from the messages which all the panelists have put forward. And with the rising scale, the cost will certainly fall down. But it's important that the major investors get into act, and the government supports this not only through some kind of a regulatory incentives or regulatory interventions, but creates the right market conditions. And I think for a region like Ladakh, those conditions do exist, because the delivery costs are extremely high. We already impose a very high level of taxes on the diesel and petrol. So I think we are moving in that direction. That sense already exists, and the conditions are right for us to take this to the logical conclusion in Ladakh. And we will certainly succeed with the government backing it up, with the Prime Minister himself having supported this kind of vision. So thank you very much once again, all the panelists, and we do look forward to a bright future for Ladakh. And I'm sure you will contribute to this in your own way. Thanks once again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Really privileged to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.